girl who returned 10 years after her funeral. There are graves in London that do not hold what they promise. There are names carved in stone that belong to women still breathing. And there are doors deep beneath the city that should never, under any circumstances, be opened again. Found written on the interior wall of a sealed tunnel beneath Hanbury Streets, 1899. The fog that never lifted. London, in the autumn of 1898, is a city trying desperately to forget. Forget the screaming that came from Whitechapel 10 years prior. Forget the women found in alleyways like discarded parcels, split open with a precision that turned the stomach of every surgeon who bore witness. Forget the letters soaked in black mockery and worse, written in blood and sent to newspapers by a man who wanted not just to kill, but to perform. The Metropolitan Police have long since buried the case files in drawers that nobody opens. The newspapers have moved on to newer scandals, newer wars, newer horrors. The residents of Whitechapel have done what the poor always do in the wake of catastrophe. They have continued, because continuation is the only luxury available to them. But London's fog does not forget. It has crept through these streets since before anyone alive can remember, rolling off the Thames in thick gray curtains, swallowing lampposts whole, turning alleyways into the throats of dark and hungry beasts. It has watched everything. Every footstep, every whispered name, every shovel of dirt thrown over a coffin lid. It watched the night Jack the Ripper last walked these streets. And it watched the night she came back. Sound design, low cello drone, the distant toll of a church bell, rain beginning to fall on cobblestones. What follows is not a comfortable story. It is not the kind of story that resolves neatly, that ties its horrors into a bow and presents them to you wrapped in the reassurance of justice served and order restored. The story of Amy Marsh is the kind that lodges itself beneath the skin like a splinter, invisible, maddening, impossible to ignore. Some of you will not sleep well after hearing it. Good. You shouldn't. Chapter 1. The Funeral in Whitechapel. October 1888. Whitechapel, in the autumn of 1888, was a place of particular desperation. 40,000 people compressed into streets designed for half that number. Slaughterhouses operating at full capacity, their runoff staining the gutters red even on days when no murderer walked. Gin houses on every corner. Children barefoot in October. The smell of the district, meat and coal smoke and human misery, was something that visitors described with barely concealed horror and something that residents had long since stopped noticing. Into this world, Amy Marsh had been born 12 years prior. She was the daughter of Thomas Marsh, a cobbler of middling talent and extraordinary stubbornness, and Catherine Marsh, née Holloway, who had worked as a seamstress until her eyesight began to fail. Amy was their only surviving child. 3 others had not made it past infancy, which in Whitechapel in the 1880s was not so much a tragedy as it was a statistic. She was, by all accounts who survive, a peculiar child. Not in the manner that suggests illness or simple-mindedness, but in the manner of someone who has always seemed to be listening to a conversation happening just out of earshot. She collected things, buttons, pieces of broken glass, feathers, and kept them in a tin box beneath her bed. She had taught herself to read from a Bible left behind by a previous tenant, and was, at 12, already more literate than most adults on her streets. She also had the habit, unsettling to adults, charming to other children, of remembering everything. Every face, every name, every detail. It was this habit that would, in the end, make her dangerous. The autumn of 1888 had already been marked by horror before Amy Marsh's story truly began. The woman called Mary Ann Nichols had been found in Bucks Row in August, the first, though nobody yet knew it, of a series. Annie Chapman followed in September. Then, in the terrible double event of the 30th, Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes in a single night, as though the killer were making a point about quantity. The newspapers were already calling him Jack the Ripper, already printing the letters he sent with a combination of outrage and barely concealed delight. The Metropolitan Police were drowning in tips, leads, hoaxes, and their own incompetence. And Amy Marsh was 12 years old and walking home through Mitre Square on the night of October the 14th, 1888, when she saw what she should never have seen. Amy, VO. I had been to Mrs. Hartley's on Aldgate Streets, returning her husband's boots which father had repaired. I should have taken Commercial Road home, but the lamp on the corner had gone dark, and I did not like the feel of that particular darkness, so I cut through Mitre Square instead. He was standing quite still at the far end, near the passage to Duke Streets. I could not see his face clearly. He wore a coat dark, long, and a hat that cast his face in shadow. He was not moving. And at his feet. I will not write what was at his feet. He did not see me. I pressed myself against the wall and I did not breathe. I did not move. I stood there for what felt like the length of my entire life. Then he looked up, not at me, at the fog, as though he were listening to something inside it. He turned and walked away. I ran. Amy Marsh told no one what she had seen that night. She was 12. She was poor. She was a girl. The Metropolitan Police in 1888 had not distinguished themselves by taking the testimony of any such person with particular seriousness, and Amy, sharp as she was, understood this with the practical clarity of the Whitechapel born. But she remembered his face. In the brief moment before his hat had shadowed it. In the split second when the gas lamp from Duke Streets had caught his profile in a yellow crescent of light. She remembered everything. 3 days after Amy's encounter in Mitre Square, something happened in the early hours of the morning that the local fire brigade would later classify as an accidental domestic fire, cause of origin undetermined, probably an overturned candle or an ember from an unguarded grate. Thomas and Catherine Marsh died in their beds. The fire was brief but total. These Whitechapel houses, timber-framed and centuries old, burned with the enthusiasm of things that had been waiting for an excuse. Amy was found at 5 in the morning by a neighbor, sitting in the middle of Dorset streets in her nightgown, staring at the flames. She was taken to the workhouse infirmary. She had no burns. She had no visible injuries. She would not speak. Dr. PMBRTON, to a nurse quietly, she's in shock, possibly for some days. He pauses, looking at Amy's profile. Poor creature, both parents gone, no relatives that anyone's been able to locate. He sighs. Make a note for the parish. She'll need to go somewhere. Nurse, where does a child like her go, doctor? Doctor, PMBRTON. Already moving to the next bed, wherever God puts her, I expect. Amy Marsh did not go wherever God put her. 4 days after her admission to the infirmary, she was gone. Her bed was empty. The nurse on duty swore she had checked on the girl not 2 hours before and found her sleeping. Nobody saw her leave. A search of the surrounding streets found nothing. The police, already overwhelmed by the Ripper investigation, gave the matter perhaps 20 minutes of their attention before determining that the girl had likely run off on her own. Streets children did. It was not unusual. It was, in fact, depressingly common. 2 weeks later, a badly burned body was recovered from the ruins of the Marsh home during a more thorough clearing of the site. The body was that of a child, female, approximately the right age, the right size. The fire had made more precise identification impossible. The parish recorded it as Amy Marsh. A small funeral was held on a Thursday morning in late October. It rained with the particular commitment of an English autumn. Half of Dorset streets attended, because death, even expected death, even the death of someone you barely knew, broke the routine in a way that was almost a relief. Reverend Alcott of Christ Church, Spitalfields, read the service over a small coffin made of deal wood. Nobody cried. Or rather, one person cried. An old woman named Agatha Fenwick, who had been Catherine Marsh's neighbor for 30 years and had watched Amy grow from an infant, stood at the back of the small crowd and wept with the uninhibited grief of the very old, who have learned that restraint in the face of sorrow is a waste of the time they have left. Visual, the coffin being lowered, the rain, the mud, the small crowd dispersing with the Amy Marsh was buried in the municipal cemetery at Bow. In a plot so modest that the gravestone, a flat marker, barely a foot high, was within 10 years half submerged in the ground, its inscription fading to near illegibility. Amy Marsh, born 1876, died 1888, in God's keeping. In God's keeping. 10 years would pass. Chapter 2, A Knock at Midnight. November 1898. Detective Inspector Arthur John had retired from the Metropolitan Police in 1895, at the age of 52, with a pension that required supplementing through occasional private consultation work, a bad knee that predicted rain with more accuracy than the meteorological office, and a file cabinet in his study that he had never managed to bring himself to empty. The file cabinet contained, among other things, everything he had collected on the Ripper case. He had been a young detective constable in 1888, assigned to the Whitechapel murders investigation under Inspector Aberline. He had worked the case for 2 years. He had interviewed hundreds of witnesses. He had followed leads through the slaughterhouses and lodging houses and gin halls of the East End until each one dissolved into nothing. He had been present at 3 of the post-mortem examinations, an experience that had populated his dreams with unwelcome regularity ever since. He had never stopped thinking about it. On the night of November the 3rd, 1898, a storm of considerable violence was conducting itself over London. The Thames was running high. Slates were coming off rooftops in Stepney. Trees in Victoria Park were losing arguments with the wind. John had been in his study until nearly midnight, doing what he often did during storms, looking at the maps, looking at the pattern, wondering, for perhaps the 10,000th time, whether the answer was there, and he simply couldn't see it. He had poured himself a second whiskey, and was in the act of bringing it to his lips when someone knocked on his front door. John, muttering to himself at this hour, in this weather, he sets down the glass. Good Lord, what now? He would describe the moment later, in the private journal that became one of the primary sources for this investigation, with the careful, clinical precision of a man trying to outrun his own terror through the reassurance of exact language. John V.O. The door opened. The storm came in, a blast of cold air and rain so violent it extinguished the hallway lamp. I could see nothing for a moment. Then my eyes adjusted. She was standing on the step, a girl, or a young woman. I revised my first impression immediately because there was something in her bearing that was not the bearing of a child, though her face was young. She wore a dark dress, soaked through with rain, no hat, no coat. Her hair was black and plastered flat against her skull by the downpour. Her hands, held at her sides, were pale as paper. She was not shivering. That was the first thing that registered as wrong. The temperature had been near freezing all day. The rain was ice-cold. She had clearly been out in it for some considerable time, and she was not shivering. She stood perfectly still and looked at me. Her eyes were very dark. I said, and I admit I said it with rather less composure than I would have preferred, "Good Lord, girl, what's happened to you? Come in, come in." And I stood aside. She stepped across the threshold. She said nothing. She looked at the hallway with an expression I can only describe as recognition, the way you look at a room you have been away from for a very long time. And then she looked at me. She said, "You were at my funeral." I should explain that at this point, naturally, I assumed she was confused, delirious, possibly concussed, something explicable. I said, "I'm sorry, I don't think I've had the..." She said, "John, Detective Constable John, you stood at the back and you didn't remove your hat until Reverend Alcott told you to." I had not, to my knowledge, ever told anyone that story. I said, "Who are you?" She said, "I'm Amy Marsh. You buried me 10 years ago, but you buried the wrong girl." Arthur John was a rational man. He had spent 30 years in the Metropolitan Police. He had seen liars and fraudsters and the mentally ill and the grief-stricken, and he had become, over those 30 years, quite good at distinguishing between them. He stood in his hallway in the middle of the night, in the middle of a storm, with a pale, wet girl who claimed to be a dead child, and he did what any rational man would do. He put the kettle on. Small beat of dark humor in the music, a brief, incongruous pizzicato, gone in a moment. "John, From the kitchen, calling through the doorway, "Sit down then. Wherever you like. Mind the stack of newspapers by the armchair. They'll avalanche if you brush them." John, entering with 2 cups, stopping when he sees her at the map. "You know what that is." Amy, without turning, "That's my streets." A pause. "That's where we lived. Father's shop was here." Her finger traces a route. "And that passage there, behind Miller's Court, that's where he came from. The night I saw him." Beat of silence. John, carefully, "Who came from there?" Amy turns and looks at him with those dark, unreadable eyes. "Amy, you know who. You've been staring at his picture for 10 years. The storm outside intensifies. The window rattles in its frame. John sets down the teacups very carefully. "John, quietly, Miss Amy, whatever your name is, I need you to understand that what you're implying." "Amy, I saw his face. I remembered it. I've been remembering it for 10 years, trying to work out who he was, because I was 12 years old when I saw him and I didn't know." She pauses. "I know now." A long silence. John, sitting down heavily in his armchair, "Sit down, child, please, and start from the beginning." Amy sits. She is still not shivering. She wraps both hands around the teacup but does not drink. She looks at John with that terrible patience. "Amy, the beginning is 10 years ago, but the end, I think, is now." Whatever Arthur John had imagined his retirement would look like, it had not looked like this. Chapter 3. The Impossible Return. November 1898. Over the course of that first night and much of the following morning, Arthur John listened. Amy spoke with a precision that unnerved him, not because her story was inherently impossible, but because of the details, the texture of her memory, the specific caliber of her recall. She remembered the name of the nurse who had attended her in the workhouse infirmary. She remembered the exact words Reverend Alcott had spoken at her funeral, words that would have required access to records John doubted she could have obtained through any conventional means. And she had known, without being told, that he had not removed his hat. "John, setting down his pen, all right. Let's approach this methodically. You say the body that was buried in your name was not yours. Whose was it?" "Amy, I don't know, I didn't look." She pauses. "I was afraid." "John, you set the fire." Amy, her jaw tightens slightly, "No." "John, then who?" Amy, "Someone who knew I had seen something I shouldn't have. Someone who knew I would remember it." John, leaning forward, "You said last night you know who it was. Jack the Ripper. Do you mean to tell me you know the man's identity and you've been carrying it for 10 years? Amy, "I knew his face. It took me 10 years to put a name to it." She meets his eyes. "I've been in very many places, Mr. John, doing a great deal of quiet research. You'd be surprised what you can learn when no one knows you exist." Beat. John, dryly, "I see. So you've spent a decade as a ghost, conducting your own private investigation into." Amy, "That's not inaccurate." John, after a long pause, "Right." He reaches for his pen again. "Right then." Narration. The first thing John did, before anything else, was verify what could be verified. He still had contacts within the Metropolitan Police, junior officers he had mentored who were now senior themselves. He called in the considerable weight of accumulated professional favors. Within 48 hours, he had confirmed the following. The municipal burial records at Bow Cemetery recorded the interment of one Amy Marsh on October the 22nd, 1888, Plot 14, Section C, Row 9. The record was signed by the registrar, countersigned by the attending physician, a Dr. Pemberton, and filed in the standard manner. He also confirmed, through channels that required slightly more delicacy, that the grave had never been disturbed. Which meant that either Amy Marsh was not in that coffin, or she was. And since she was sitting in his study drinking his wife's good china, the former seemed the more probable option. Constable Briggs. Quietly, to John, "I should say for the record, sir, that this is highly irregular." John, "Note it then." Constable Briggs, "And if we find something in there?" John, "That rather depends on what we find." Gravedigger, Calling over, sir. John approaches. He looks down into the grave. The interior of the excavation. A deal wood coffin, its lid partially rotted. The gravedigger has lifted the lid away. The interior is revealed. Long pause. The camera does not show us what John sees. It shows us only his face, the slight widening of his eyes, the way his jaw tightens, the very deliberate manner in which he breathes. John, quietly empty. The constables exchange a look. Constable Briggs, sir. John, the coffin is empty, Briggs. There is nothing in it. No body, no remains, no. He pauses. Nothing. He straightens up and brushes dirt from his knees with the careful precision of a man collecting himself. Fill it back in, and not a word of this to anyone. The coffin was not entirely empty, as it turned out. Wedged into the corner beneath where a head would have rested was a small object that John almost missed, a tin box, roughly 3 inches square, its lid rusted shut. He pried it open in the cemetery, crouching beside the filled grave while the constables wrote up their report at a diplomatic distance. Inside the tin box were the contents of a child's private collection. Buttons, pieces of colored glass, 3 feathers perfectly preserved in the airless metal, a small ivory button, a scrap of paper folded many times on which was written in a child's careful hand. I remember everything. If you find this, you should know that I remember everything. TM. He brought the tin box back to Amy. When he placed it on the table in front of her, she went very still. She looked at it for a long time without touching it. Then she opened it and looked at the contents, and for a single moment, one brief, unguarded moment, her face changed. Something cracked open behind those dark eyes, and she looked exactly like what she was. A child who had lost everything. Then it closed again. Amy, her voice completely level, I put this in the coffin myself. 3 days before the fire, I don't know why. She picks up the note, reads it. I think I must have known, even then. John, known what? Amy, that I would have to disappear. She sets the note down. That being alive was going to get me killed. Chapter 4, The Street Says Remember. November 1898. Against John's explicit advice, Amy began walking the streets of Whitechapel within days of her return. He had told her to stay inside. She had looked at him with the patient tolerance of someone who has spent 10 years moving through the world on their own terms, and she had gone out anyway. He had followed her, because the alternative was sitting at home, imagining the various disasters that could befall a young woman alone in the East End, and that was worse. John, quietly appearing at Amy's shoulder, your father's shop. Amy, it was a boot repair shop when he had it. Before that, I believe it was a tallow chandler's. She pauses. It smelled of leather and wax, and there was always a coal scuttle by the door, and father kept a tin of aniseed balls on the countertop that he thought I didn't know about. A very small pause. He was a very bad cobbler, actually, but he was patient, and people liked him. John, after a moment, I'm sorry. Amy, turning away, let's keep moving. The fear began slowly. An old woman at the corner of Flower and Dean Streets saw Amy pass and went white as chalk. She grabbed the arm of the woman beside her and said, in a voice not quite low enough, "That's the Marsh girl. That's little Amy Marsh. She died. I went to her funeral." The woman beside her looked and saw nothing remarkable, a pale young woman in a dark dress, but the old woman stood staring long after Amy had passed, and she would not come out of her room the following day. Docker, barely above a whisper, God Almighty, that can't be. Companion, what is it, Charlie? What do you see? Docker, I helped carry her coffin. He does not look away from Amy. I was one of the pallbearers. She was light as nothing. I thought, poor little thing, 12 years old. He stops. That's her. That's the dead girl. Amy pauses. She has heard this, or perhaps she simply feels the weight of the stairs. She turns and looks directly at the group of men, not threateningly, not apologetically, just looks, meeting each gaze in turn with her calm, dark eyes. The men step back. One of them, the youngest, crosses himself. Within a week, 3 specific and distinct rumors were circulating through Whitechapel. with the velocity that only the combination of genuine fear and genuine boredom can generate. The first, that Amy Marsh had returned from the dead, and that her return was an omen. Opinions differed on what it was an omen of, but the prevailing view was that it was nothing good. The second, that she was not Amy Marsh at all, but rather some other woman who had been driven mad by some unspecified horror and believed herself to be the dead girl. The third, and this was the one that spread fastest, the one that started in a lodging house on Thrall Streets and had reached as far as Aldgate by the following Tuesday, was the worst of all. That Jack the Ripper had come back, that the killings had started again, that the dead girl walking the streets was not a ghost but a harbinger that wherever she went, blood would follow. No new killings had occurred, but fear, once properly seated, requires no factual basis to grow. PRYCE, leaning forward, voice low, you want my honest advice, Arthur. Whatever this girl is, whatever she is, whether she's the Marsh child or some other unfortunate, get her out of the area. Before someone decides the problem is best solved the old-fashioned way. John, you're suggesting. PRYCE, I'm suggesting that some of the men in this neighborhood are old enough to remember 1888, and they weren't calm men then, and 10 years of gin and poverty haven't made them calmer. If they decide she's bad luck, or worse, he shakes his head. I've seen what crowds do, Arthur. You have too. John, she won't leave. PRYCE, raising an eyebrow, she won't. John, I suggested it, with considerable force. She informed me very politely that she had not come back to Whitechapel to leave it, that there was something she had to find here. He takes a sip of his drink. She's remarkably difficult to argue with, for someone who barely raises her voice. PRYCE, almost amused in spite of himself, what is she looking for? John, setting down his glass, she says she's looking for evidence, that it's here somewhere in Whitechapel, and it has been here all along, waiting for someone to find it. He pauses. The evidence that would name the Ripper. The evidence that someone destroyed her family to prevent her from providing. Price is quiet for a long moment. PRYCE, and do you believe her? John, a long pause. I opened an empty grave, Samuel. I've run out of disbelief. Chapter 5, The Blood-Stained Letter. November 1898. Amy led John to the building on Hanbury Streets on the morning of November the 17th. She had not explained how she knew to go there. When John pressed her, she said only that she had been thinking that during 10 years of what she called her disappearance, she had retraced the events of 1888 so many times in her mind that the geography had become almost physical, a map superimposed on the real streets, and that certain locations had begun to seem significant in ways she couldn't fully articulate. The abandoned building on Hanbury Streets was one of them. John, quietly watch your step, these boards. A creak, he freezes, nothing follows. John, continuing with studied calm, these boards are not trustworthy. Amy, already moving toward the staircase, second floor, back room. John, and you know this because... Amy, because I was here once before, in 1888, a month before the fire. She had been here, she told him as they climbed, because a man had asked her to deliver a message. Not an unusual occurrence. In Whitechapel in 1888, children ran messages constantly, for a penny or two per delivery, no questions asked. Amy had done it many times. This man had been different, she said. He had not been from the neighborhood. He had been well-dressed, too well-dressed, and he had watched her with the particular evaluating attention of someone who has determined that the person in front of them is either useful or disposable, and has not yet decided which. He had given her a sealed letter and an address on Hanbury Streets and 3 pennies, which was far too much for such a job, which was itself a warning sign she had been 12 years old and hadn't recognized. John, how long has that? Amy, I found it when I came to deliver the letter. There was someone in the room, not the man who sent me, someone else, and I panicked and hid under the bed. She lifts the box. I saw them put this under the board. I didn't understand what I was seeing. I was 12. She hands the box to John. I came back for it later, but the building had already been emptied and sealed, and I could never get in. Then the fire, then everything else. She meets his eyes. I don't think anyone has touched it in 10 years. The box contained 3 items. The first was a letter, handwritten, dated October the 6th, 1888, 2 days before what would prove to be the final canonical Ripper murder, addressed to no one and signed with nothing. It described in precise and chillingly unemotional language a meeting, a time and a place. A woman's name, Harriet Colton. Harriet Colton had never appeared in any Ripper-related police record. She had never been identified as a victim. She had never, so far as any official investigation had ever determined, existed in connection with these events at all. The second item was a small photograph. A woman, mid-30s perhaps, with the careful, slightly rigid expression of someone not accustomed to being photographed. She was well-dressed. She was not from Whitechapel. The third item was a folded page, smaller than the others, which appeared to have been torn from a journal or ledger. At the top, in different handwriting from the letter, smaller, sharper, almost a physician's hand, were the words. She saw, she must be dealt with before she speaks. HC, arranged through the usual channel. The children are always useful in this regard. Visual, John face as he reads this last note. He sits down very slowly on the edge of the iron bed frame, heedless of the rust and dust. John, very quietly, the children. He looks up at Amy. John, the delivery children. He used them too. Amy, her voice completely steady to deliver messages, to carry things. A pause, to be seen in certain places, so that when something happened in those places, there would be a child who could be blamed for it, or used. Another pause. I wasn't the only child he used, but I think I was the only one he decided was dangerous. John, because you saw his face. Amy, because I remembered it. The building settles around them. Somewhere below, the wind finds a gap and moves through the empty rooms with a sound that is almost a voice. John, staring at the physician's note, who is HC. Amy, very quietly, that's what we need to find out. Chapter 6, The Underground Tunnels. Late November 1898. London, in 1898, was a city built on layers. The Victorians, with their characteristic combination of ambition and total disregard for whatever had come before them, had constructed their magnificent metropolis directly on top of everything that preceded it. Medieval streets existed 20 feet below current road level. Roman walls ran through the basements of Georgian buildings. The old Fleet River, long since covered and converted to a sewer, still ran beneath Farringdon Road, its current slow and black and persistent. And beneath Whitechapel, beneath the market streets and the slaughterhouses and the lodging houses, there were passages that did not appear on any official map. The chalk message had been erased before it could be properly photographed, by order of the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, who was concerned it would inflame anti-Semitic feeling in the district. Whether it was left by the killer, by someone else, or was entirely unrelated, was a question that had never been answered. Amy believed the passage, beneath, that building was related to, why the message had been found there. She had learned of the underground tunnels during her decade of disappearance, had, in fact, navigated some portion of them, in circumstances she was not yet prepared to fully discuss. She knew the entrance. She knew which passages were navigable. She even knew some of what they had been used for. John, his voice slightly hollow in the tunnel acoustics, how far do these go? Amy, they connect to the old Fleet tributary system further west. To the east, they run under Aldgate and come up near St. Catherine's Docks. John, and people actually use these, regularly. Amy, body smugglers mainly in the earlier part of the century. Medical schools needed cadavers and didn't ask too many questions about their origins. Later, various other trades. She pauses. The Ripper may have used them to move between locations, without being seen on the streets. This had been a theory proposed by several investigators during the original inquiry, but without any physical evidence, it had remained exactly that. If the killer had used underground passages to travel between crime scenes, it would explain several otherwise puzzling aspects of the timeline. How a man who should have been visible on the streets in the immediate aftermath of the murders had apparently vanished without a trace. John, what in God's name? Visual, the markings on the brick, not graffiti, not random. Geometric patterns, circles, triangles, lines connecting them in arrangements that suggest system, code, or ritual. At certain intersections, the marks are darker, as though made with a different substance. John, is that? Amy, studying the marks, yes. A pause, I think so. John, who is not really asking blood. Some of these are made in blood. The lantern flickers. The tunnel seems briefly to breathe. Amy, these were navigational markers. The tunnels branch in many directions, and without the right map, which only certain people had, you'd be lost in minutes. The marks told you which way to go. She traces a geometric pattern with her finger, not touching. But there's something else. She points to a section of wall where the marks are more densely clustered. These are newer, made after 1888. John, how can you tell? Amy, because I came down here in 1893. These weren't here then. She meets his eyes in the lamplight. Someone has been using these tunnels recently. They followed the marks for 200 yards before reaching a chamber, not large, but larger than the tunnel, with a ceiling high enough to stand comfortably and a floor of beaten earth. The chamber appeared to have served some purpose. There were iron rings set into the walls at intervals, presumably for lamps or tethering. In the center of the floor, the outline of something that might once have been a fireplace or a pit. On the wall directly opposite the entrance passage, the marks were most concentrated, and among them, written in the same dark substance, were 3 letters. HCM. Visual, John stares at the letters. Amy is very still. John, HC, he thinks. The note from the box. HC and now HCM. Amy, very quietly, Hanbury, Church, Marsh. Silence. John, slowly, Marsh, as in your family name. Amy, her jaw very tight, as in my father. He knew something. He saw something. He wasn't simply, she stops. For the first time, something that might be anger crosses her face. They killed him because of what he knew, not because of what I saw. I was a convenience, an additional reason. She looks at the letters. My father was involved in something, or knew about something, something connected to whoever wrote that note. John, and the C church. There's 100 churches in. Amy, already turning back toward the passage, not a church. The one that isn't on any map. She walks. Come on, we're not ready for it yet. John followed her. He noted in his journal that evening, becoming rapidly accustomed to following her, and was no longer entirely sure whether this was a reasonable response to a compelling investigation or evidence of something having gone seriously wrong with his professional judgment. He decided not to examine the question too carefully. Chapter 7. The Doctor of Hambury Streets. December 1898. It was the 3rd letter, HCM. John, working through the night after their underground excursion, cross-referenced every possible interpretation. Hanbury, church, marsh, 3 separate elements, or a person, HCM as initials. He had gone through his Ripper files, the accumulation of a decade of private obsession, searching for any name with those initials that had ever appeared in connection with the case, however tangentially. He found it in a footnote in his own handwriting, from 1889. A note made during a routine follow-up interview, never pursued further, never connected to anything significant. Spoke with Dr. A.M. Church, Spitalfields, who reports seeing a man matching general description near Hanbury Streets approx. 5 a.m. on Sept 8. Cannot confirm details. Church has good local reputation, established surgery, respected. No further follow-up deemed necessary at this time. Dr. Aldous Mervyn Church was 61 years old and had practiced surgery in Spitalfields for 32 years. He was a fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons. He had published papers on the treatment of abdominal injuries. He served on the board of the London Hospital and was a regular attendee at Christ Church, where he had recently endowed a new east window. He was also, according to rumors that John spent 3 days carefully excavating from beneath decades of accumulated professional respectability, something else entirely. John, quietly, I'm not here to cause trouble for anyone, Mrs. Croft. least of all for you. I simply want to understand what happened. Margaret. Wrapping her hands around her tea, not drinking, you don't know what you're asking. John, I'm asking about Dr. Church. Margaret. Long pause, he was a brilliant surgeon, genuinely brilliant. The things he could do, the precision of his hands, you'd hold your breath watching him in theater. Another pause. He was also conducting work that was not in any departmental register, not in any hospital record. John, what kind of work? Margaret. Her voice dropping very low, anatomical work, the kind that requires subjects, that cannot be obtained through normal channels. She stops. Something moves across her face, old fear not entirely diminished by time. I found his notes once. By accident, a drawer left unlocked. He was studying something. The capacity of the human body to, I don't have the medical vocabulary, to survive, to persist, under conditions that should be terminal. John, very carefully, Mrs. Croft. Are you saying Dr. Church was experimenting on living people? Margaret. Not looking at him, I'm saying I found his notes, and I replaced them, and I never opened that drawer again, and 3 months later I left the hospital. Finally, she looks up. I've told no one about this for 15 years. She meets his eyes. What are you going to do with it? John, find out what he's been doing. John brought what he had to Amy that evening. She listened with that characteristic stillness. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, he was the man who examined the bodies. After the Ripper victims were found, he was called in as a consulting surgeon. John had known this, it was in the files. He had not connected it. Amy, he was present at 3 of the post-mortem examinations. He had access to the physical evidence before it was catalogued. She thinks. And he had access to the files, the witness statements. He would have known everything the police knew, almost as soon as they knew it. John, if he were the Amy, or if he knew who was, if he were protecting someone. She looks at John. The note said the physician's hand, someone with surgical precision. The Ripper's incisions were noted by every medical examiner to show anatomical knowledge. John, the prevailing theory was always that. Amy, I know what the prevailing theories were. She stands. I'd like to speak with him. John, absolutely not. Amy, already putting on her coat, he won't know who I am. I'm a dead girl, remember? She looks back at him. Come if you want. John, in a low, urgent tone, Amy. If this man is what we think he might be, if he was involved in the Ripper murders in your families, we cannot simply knock on his door and... Amy, not looking at him, he's expecting someone. John, what? Amy, I sent him a letter this morning from one of his former patients, supposedly asking for an evening consultation. She begins crossing the streets. He always accommodated evening consultations, according to his nurse, who I spoke with yesterday. John, following appalled, you spoke with his, when did you? Amy, you were asleep. I don't sleep very much anymore. She reaches the door, she knocks. A long pause, then the sound of footsteps within. Dr. Church, his voice measured, almost academic in its control, can I help you? John, Dr. Church. I'm Arthur John, formerly of the Metropolitan Police. I wonder if we might come in. Church does not look at John. He is still looking at Amy. Dr. Church, very quietly, I know who you are, Inspector. A pause, and I think I know who she is. His eyes behind the glasses are very calm and very cold. I wondered when this day would come. He steps back from the door. Come in then, both of you. Chapter 8, The Girl Who Never Aged. December 1898. What followed was one of the strangest conversations that Arthur John, who had, in his career, conducted some fairly strange conversations, had ever experienced. Church spoke carefully. He chose his words with the precision of someone who has spent a lifetime being precise and sees no reason to abandon the habit now. He confirmed some things. He denied others. He volunteered certain information unprompted, in a manner that suggested either genuine relief at the chance to speak or an extremely sophisticated form of misdirection. But mostly, he watched Amy. Dr. Church, To John, but his eyes on Amy. You want to know about the murders? Yes, I thought someone eventually would. I'm only somewhat surprised it took this long. He presses his fingertips together. What precisely do you want to know? John, we found your initials in the underground tunnels. Dr. Church, without visible alarm, yes, I used those passages from time to time for research transport. A slight pause, and occasionally for personal movement between locations where I preferred not to be observed. John, during the murders. Dr. Church, his gaze finally moving to John during the aftermath of the murders. I was engaged in certain examinations of the sites. He stops. I was not the Ripper, Inspector. I want to be clear about that. I was something else. Something perhaps equally culpable in the eyes of the law, though not in terms of direct harm. John, explain that. Dr. Church, leaning back, I knew who the Ripper was. After the second murder, I knew. And I did not come forward. I had reasons. Complex reasons. The kind that seemed compelling at the time, and he looks at Amy, look rather different with the passage of years. Amy, speaking for the first time, why didn't you come forward? Dr. Church, very quietly because he was my patient, and because I knew what he knew about me. We had an arrangement, a mutually assured silence, one might say. He removes his glasses and polishes them, a gesture that seems almost unconscious. He knew about my research, the research that was not recorded in any hospital file. He had documented it, had it stored somewhere I could not access, a form of insurance. Amy, and the fire on Dorset streets. Church goes very still. Dr. Church, slowly, you know about that. Amy, my father knew about your arrangement, about what you'd done. He'd seen you in the tunnels. He was going to go to the police. Dr. Church, after a long pause, yes. John, his voice dangerously quiet, did you arrange the fire? Dr. Church, not looking away, no, that was not my doing, that was his. He had a way of addressing problems. I was not consulted. I did not, he stops. Something crosses his face, not quite guilt, but its close and uncomfortable relative. I did not stop it. Silence in the room. The fire pops. Amy is looking at Church with an expression that John cannot read. Amy, and the girl in the coffin, the one you buried in my place. Dr. Church, something finally shifting behind those cold eyes. I don't know who she was. I was never told. I was only... He stops again. I sign the death certificate. Thomas Marsh, Catherine Marsh, Amy Marsh, 3 deaths, 1 body recovered. I said it was the child. His voice, for the first time, is slightly unsteady. She was approximately the right age. The fire had, there was no way to be certain. Amy, you knew I was alive. Dr. Church, looking at her directly for the first time with something that might be shame, I suspected. And I chose not to look more carefully. A long pause. I have made a great many choices in my life that I chose not to examine too carefully. It was during this conversation that Amy did something that John had not expected. She leaned forward and, without warning, pulled back the sleeve of her dress, exposing her left forearm. On the inner wrist, in very neat, regular text, was writing, not a tattoo, not ink, but something that looked almost like scar tissue, raised and white against her skin. The writing was in a cipher, symbols and characters that John didn't recognize. Church stared at it, and then, for the first time in the conversation, his composure cracked. Not dramatically, not with visible fear or distress, but the precise control in his face loosened, and underneath it was something raw. Dr. Church, barely above a whisper, where did you get that? Amy, pulling her sleeve back down, 10 years is a long time. She stands. You know what it is, and you know what it means that I have it. She looks at him with those dark, fathomless eyes. It means I've been somewhere you sent others but never followed yourself. She turns to John. We should go. John, who has approximately 17 questions, right? Yes. He stands, not quite steady. Dr. Church, this conversation is not concluded. Dr. Church, still staring at Amy's back, no, I don't expect it is. He pauses. Inspector. John pauses at the door. Be careful with her. A very long pause. She is not entirely what you think she is. What happened to her, what was done to her, what she survived. He seems to grope for words in a manner entirely at odds with his earlier precision. There are things that change a person, Inspector, irrevocably. You may find, as this progresses, that the line between victim and something else becomes difficult to locate. That night, John sat in his study and looked at the maps for a long time. Then he wrote in his journal, "She does not sleep. She barely eats. She moves through this city as though she has already memorized it from above, from a height, and at a remove. She is 22 years old, and she has eyes that are older than I am. And she is right about the cipher on her wrist. I have seen that symbol system before. I could not immediately place it. I placed it this evening. It appears in the Journal of a Medical Researcher, published privately, 1891. A man writing about experiments in, and I am copying this exactly, the prolongation and modification of the vital consciousness through chemical and surgical means. The journal was written by a physician who had access to the Ripper victims' bodies. Its author was Aldous Mervyn Church. The lamp in John's study flickers. The fog presses at the window. Somewhere in the house, barely audible, the sound of Amy moving through rooms she has memorized, quiet, purposeful, and absolutely impossible to sleep through. Chapter 9. The Church Beneath the Fog. December 1898. Amy told him about the church beneath the fog, her name for it, which turned out to be more literally accurate than John had assumed, on the 2nd of December. She had been there before, she said. This was not a surprise to John by this point. Very little that she said surprised him anymore, which was itself, he recognized, a symptom of something. What she described was a medieval chapel, pre-Reformation, she thought, and possibly pre-Norman if the construction methods she had seen were any guide. That had been built beneath the foundations of a church that no longer existed above ground. The above-ground church had been demolished in the 17th century. The crypt had been sealed. And then, at some point in the latter half of the 19th century, it had been unsealed. Someone had been using this space. And recently. The evidence was clear. The ash in the brazier was not 10 years old. The candle stubs affixed to iron holders on the walls were not 10 years old. The marks on the floor, geometric patterns echoing those in the tunnels above, but more elaborate, more deliberate, had been made with material that had not yet fully dried. John, to himself grimly still fresh. He looks around the chapel. He looks at Amy, who is standing in the center, turning slowly, taking it all in. John, what was this used for? Amy, meetings, of a specific group. She pauses. I found a reference to them in some documents I obtained during my disappearance. They called themselves the Covenant of Persistent Lives. She says this matter-of-factly, as though it is no stranger than saying the Whitechapel Tenants Association. They are a group of men, primarily medical men, who share a specific set of beliefs about death and its negotiability. John, after a very long pause, its negotiability. Amy, they believe death can be postponed, through specific means, through specific preparations. She stops in front of the altar. Church was a member, so was the man I saw in Mitre Square. John, the Ripper. Amy, he was not the Ripper in the conventional sense. He did not choose his victims randomly. He chose them because they were what the Covenant needed. The deaths were functional. The manner of them was functional. The incisions, the removals, they were not the work of a madman. They were surgical, purposeful. She turns to John. Each victim had something in common with the others, something that only a physician would know to look for, a particular biological characteristic, a rarity. John, good God, you're saying the murders were. Amy, procurement for research. She pauses. Church didn't commit them himself, but he designed the criteria. He knew who was chosen and why. He processed what was collected. A long silence. The chapel is very cold. The candle stubs are dark. John, sitting down heavily on one of the wooden benches, and your father. What did he know? Amy, he used to do small repairs for some of the men who came here, boots and such. He overheard conversations he shouldn't have. He understood enough to be frightened. He told me the night before the fire that there were men in Whitechapel who had discovered something about staying alive, about not dying in the way that people normally die. Her voice is very level. He told me they were powerful men who would do terrible things to protect that secret. John, looking at her, Amy, the cipher on your arm, Church's research. The things he said last night about you not being entirely, he stops. He looks at her for a very long time. What happened to you in those 10 years? Amy turns and meets his gaze. Her dark eyes in the lamplight are, for one moment, extraordinary, deep as wells, old as stones. Amy, quietly, I survived. A pause, but survival always has a cost. Another pause. The important thing is that it also gives you knowledge, and I have everything I need to finally end this. She turns back to the altar. We just need to find the phonograph recording. John, completely lost the what? Amy, Church mentioned it last night, when I showed him the cipher on my arm. He thought I already knew about it, or he wouldn't have let it slip. He said, and these were his exact words, "You've been where the recording was made." She looks at John. Amy, he meant this chapel. Chapter 10, Jack's Final Confession. December 1898. It was behind the altar. Not hidden with any great sophistication, simply placed in a leather bag, tucked against the back of the stone table in a space that would require getting onto one's knees and reaching behind to find. A practiced or hurried searcher might miss it. A methodical one would not. The bag contained 3 wax cylinders, each approximately 6 inches in length, wrapped individually in flannel cloth. Each was labeled in pencil on a small paper tag. The labels read, Cylinder 1, Testimony. Cylinder 2, Names. Cylinder 3, Continuation. The cylinders were for use with a phonograph, a device for recording and replaying the human voice, commercially available since the late 1880s. John had one. It had been a gift from a nephew who was enthusiastic about technology and slightly deaf to the gentle suggestions of those around him that his gifts were often impractical. John, his hand slightly less than steady, ready. Amy, perfectly still, yes. He turns the crank, he sets the stylus. The cylinder begins to rotate. The voice on the recording was male. Educated, public school and Oxbridge education audible in every vowel, in the precise deployment of consonants, in the rhythm of sentences constructed by someone who has spent a great deal of time being listened to. It was not a young voice, a man in his 50s, perhaps, or 60s. It was calm. It was, most disturbingly, almost cheerful. The voice of someone who has reached the end of a long project and is compelled to document their conclusions. The recording plays. We hear it as John and Amy hear it, imperfect, crackling, but legible. Voice on recording. I am making this record on the 22nd of November, 1893, in the place that some of us have called the chapel. I don't expect anyone to find it for some years. By that time, I shall be dead by conventional means, or I shall have moved on in a different sense. Either way, this record will serve as a final account. My name does not matter. Those who know will know. Those who don't, it no longer matters. I want to say, first, that I am not sorry for what I did. I want to say that clearly, because confession implies remorse, and this is not a confession in that sense. This is a statement of fact, a scientific record, nothing more. The women I chose in 1888 were not chosen at random. Each was selected for a specific quality, a biological characteristic identified by my colleague through examination of their medical histories and confirmed by direct observation. They were raw materials. I don't ask you to like that word. I use it because it is accurate. The research required certain harvested elements that could only be obtained through the method I employed. The precision required was surgical. I was a surgeon. The precision was within my capabilities. I was also, as it happens, something of a showman, the letters were. I admit it, theatrical excess. I was younger. I was arrogant. I believed no one could touch me. I was almost right. There was a girl, a child. She saw me in the Mitre Square location on the night of an operation there, though not the primary operation that was conducted elsewhere. She saw my face. I was informed of this. I want to be clear. The fire on Dorset streets was not my decision. My colleague acted without full consultation. I would not have chosen a child. It was unnecessary. The information she possessed was not yet dangerous. I was wrong about that. I see that now. She was remarkably persistent. To whoever finds this recording, the names on cylinder 2 are the names of every member of the Covenant, living and dead. There are 14 names. Several of them will surprise you. Several of them hold positions of considerable power. Several of them have benefited directly from the research conducted in this chapel and in the tunnels beneath it. Cylinder 3 contains my methodology, for the record, because it worked. Because someone, somewhere with better moral instincts than I possessed, may one day use that methodology for purposes I would not have considered worth the effort. The prolongation of life. Genuinely, this time, without the cost. I am aware that some of what was done may have been done, in some form, to the Marsh girl. My colleague was creative in his responses to problems. If she survived, and I believe in my bones that she did, she will find this recording eventually, because she is the kind of person who finds things eventually. If you can hear this, Amy Marsh, I chose the women. The fire was not mine, but the choosing was, I carry that. Not with guilt, but with precision, I carry it with precision. It was real, all of it was real. That is all. John, his voice careful and steady with some effort, he knew you'd find it. Amy, not moving, he wanted me to. John, why? Amy, after a long pause because some part of him, the part that was still a scientist, not a murderer, wanted to be documented, wanted it to be real in the way that only recorded things are real. She stands. And because she stops, something moves in her face briefly like a shadow across water. Because even men who do monstrous things sometimes need someone to tell it to. Someone who will understand what it cost, not approve, not forgive, just comprehend. John, quietly did he do something to you, in those 10 years? Is that what the cipher means? Amy looks at him, and for a moment, just a moment, the composure cracks, and underneath is something enormous. Pain, perhaps, something ancient and not entirely human and very, very tired. Amy, very quietly, he didn't do it to me. His colleague did, because I was available and they needed a test subject and I was. She stops. Amy, let's listen to cylinder 2. Chapter 11, The Truth Inside the Coffin. December 1898. The names on cylinder 2 included 2 sitting members of Parliament. A senior judge, a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians, a man who was, at the time of the recording, serving as a chief inspector in the Metropolitan Police, which explained, among other things, the extraordinary way in which the Ripper investigation had been simultaneously over-resourced and specifically misdirected. It included Dr. Aldous Mervyn Church. And it included one more name that John sat staring at for a very long time, after the cylinder ended. Thomas Marsh, Amy's father. Not as a victim, not as a bystander, as a member. Thomas Marsh, cobbler of Dorset Street's, Whitechapel, was listed as a member of the Covenant of Persistent Lives, inducted in 1885, 3 years before the murders. He told her that evening. He considered not telling her. He considered several alternative framings. He considered, briefly, the radical option of pretending he had not heard the name and moving on. He decided, because he had spent 30 years telling himself he was an honest man and wasn't prepared to stop now, to simply tell her. John, sitting across from her, the paper between them on the table, there is one name on that list that I think you should see before I do anything else with this information. Amy looks at the paper, a long moment. Amy, very still, my father. John, yes. Silence, the fire, the fog at the window. Amy sitting with the absolutely motionless quality that John now associates with her processing something catastrophic. John, carefully being a member of the Covenant does not necessarily mean. Amy, her voice entirely without inflection, he knew. He was part of it. A pause. He wasn't killed because he was going to go to the police. Another pause. He was killed because he wanted out, because he'd seen what the research actually required and she stops. He tried to leave, and they killed him for it. John, gently, that's possible. Yes, leaving that kind of arrangement. Amy, he told me something that last night. Before the fire, I've never understood it. He held my face in his hands, he smelled of coal smoke and leather, he always smelled of that, and he said, Amy, you remember everything. One day that will save lives, I'm sorry I couldn't do better by you. A very long pause. I thought he meant he was sorry for being poor, for not being able to give me a better life. She looks down at the paper. He meant he was sorry for knowing what he knew. For the part he'd played. He knew what was going to happen and he sent me away to run messages so I would be out of the house. John, very quietly, he saved your life. Amy, after an almost unbearable silence, yes, in the only way he could. She folds the paper very precisely and sets it down. He wasn't a good man, but at the end he tried to be better than he'd been. She looks at John, and her eyes are completely dry beyond tears in a place where tears are not possible. That has to count for something, doesn't it? John, after a moment, I think it has to count for quite a lot. Cylinder 3. The methodology John listened to alone, over 3 nights, making notes in his careful detective's hand. What it described was a program of experimental procedure conducted on human subjects over a period of years, beginning in 1882, before the Ripper murders, which were only one component of a much larger operation. It described methods for what the voice on the recording called metabolic suspension and vital modification, processes that, using combinations of chemical compounds and surgical intervention, could alter the basic chemistry of a human body's aging and decay processes. It described, in the voice's chilling academicism, several subjects who had survived these procedures and been released, set loose. Subjects who were no longer quite what they had been, who aged differently, who healed differently, who moved through the world with the disturbing quality of something that had been changed at its most fundamental level. It described, at some length, a 12-year-old girl, obtained through what it called an opportunistic circumstance in late 1888, who had proven to be the most successful subject yet encountered. She was not a ghost. She was not a supernatural entity. She was not an apparition or a revenant or any of the other categories the frightened residents of Whitechapel had reached for when they saw her walking their fog-drowned streets. She was a girl who had survived something that should have killed her, and been changed by the surviving, changed in ways that were not yet fully understood, not even by the men who had done the changing to her, certainly not by her, and not yet entirely by John. She had not aged in 10 years. This was a medical fact, not a supernatural one. It was a medical fact with a medical explanation, one that the voice on the cylinder had documented with the dispassionate thoroughness of a man who has done monstrous things in the name of a discipline he loves. She remembered everything, but this had always been true. This had been true before any of it. It was who she was, fundamentally, and they had used it against her, and it had ultimately been what had brought her back. She was 22 years old with a 12-year-old's face, and the eyes of someone much, much older. And she was the only person alive who had seen Jack the Ripper's face, who carried that memory intact, who could identify him. There was one more thing. Something John discovered not from the cylinders but from a separate source, a final piece of the puzzle that had been sitting in plain sight throughout, misidentified and overlooked. He went back to the empty coffin. Not the one at Bow Cemetery. That one, as established, had contained Amy's tin box and nothing else. But there was another coffin, the one that had supposedly held the body identified as Amy Marsh. John cross-referenced the burial records and realized, with the awful clarity of a detective finally seeing the pattern, that the municipal records showed not 1 but 2 burials under the name Marsh in October 1888. The second burial, logged 3 days after the first, attributed to a clerical duplication and corrected in the margin, had been at a different cemetery entirely, at Nunhead, in South London. He went to Nunhead on the morning of December the 14th. He opened the second grave. This coffin was not empty. Inside the coffin was the body of a woman, not a child, a woman of approximately 40 years of age, in a state of preservation that was unusual. She appeared to have died of causes that the original county medical examiner had listed as natural, and that, to John's experienced eye, were clearly nothing of the sort. Around her left wrist, barely legible after 10 years of interment, were the faint traces of something written in ink. A cipher, the same cipher that marked Amy's arm. She was not a victim of the Ripper. She was a subject of the Covenant, and she had been buried in Amy's name to create the fiction of Amy's death and to simultaneously dispose of another inconvenient body. John spent the walk back from Nunhead working out how to tell Amy. In the end, he didn't have to. She was waiting for him at the door when he got home. She looked at his face and she understood, because she remembered everything, and because she had always been smarter than almost everyone who had ever underestimated her, exactly what he had found. Amy, quietly, who was she? John, I don't know yet. I will find out. Amy, nodding, turning back into the house. There's someone I need to show you. She pauses. Someone who can answer the last questions. John, removing his coat, exhausted to the bone. Church. Amy, looking back at him. No, someone who has been in Whitechapel all along, someone who knows the face I saw, someone who has been protecting that secret for 10 years out of fear. She looks at him steadily. Dr. Church has a nurse. She's been with him for 12 years. Her name is Martha Galloway. A pause. She was standing behind the curtain the night we visited Church. She heard everything. John stops. Amy, she came to me this morning, while you were at Nunhead. A very long pause. John, quietly, what did she say? Amy, with the terrible patience of someone who has waited 10 years for this moment and can wait 5 more seconds, she said she knows the name. The name that isn't on cylinder 2. The name of the man in Mitre Square. The man who designed the criteria. The man whose face I have been carrying in my memory for a decade. The fog presses at the windows of John's house. Somewhere outside, London breathes in its enormous way. The river, the traffic, the accumulated lives of millions. Amy, she told me his name, and she told me where he is. Chapter 12. The Return to Whitechapel. December 1898, the final night. His name was Sir Edmund Voss. He was 67 years old. He had been born in Hampshire, educated at Harrow and Oxford, and had trained as a physician before abandoning medical practice for the more lucrative and considerably more comfortable field of medical administration. He was, in 1898, the chairman of the board of 3 London hospitals, a Knight Commander of the Order of the Bath, a recipient of the Queen's Medical Medal, and a man of such thorough respectability that his name, appearing in any newspaper, appeared only in connection with charitable endeavors and public service. He was also the man who had stood in Mitre Square in October 1888, in a long dark coat and a hat that cast his face in shadow, and who had looked up at the fog and listened to something in it, while at his feet lay the evidence of what he had done. Martha Galloway had worked for Church for 12 years and had known the truth for 10 of them. She had kept the secret because she was afraid, because she had seen, in the early days of her employment, enough of what the Covenant could do to dissuade her very efficiently from voluntary disclosure. But Amy coming back, Amy walking those streets, Amy sitting across from Church with those eyes and showing that cipher on her wrist, had changed something in Martha Galloway, had broken open something long sealed. I've been carrying this, she told Amy that morning in John's kitchen, while John was at Nunhead. I've been carrying it since 1888, and I'm 61 years old, and I'm tired of carrying it. And if a girl who has done worse than I could imagine can walk back into these streets and start pulling things into the light, then I can tell you his name. She told her. And then she told her something else. Sir Edmund Voss was in London. He was at his club in St. James's most evenings, where he had kept a room since his wife's death the previous year. He was a creature of habit. Clubs for dinner, a specific route home through Mayfair, a particular cigar on a particular bench in Green Park on nights when the weather permitted. But Martha Galloway knew something else, something she had learned by keeping her ears open and her face down during 12 years of being invisible in Church's presence. Voss came to Whitechapel still, on certain nights, not often, perhaps twice a year in the dark months. He came alone, and he took the underground passage from the Galston Street's entrance, and he went to the chapel beneath the fog. And Martha believed he went there to be near the only place where the work he had done, the work that had cost so much, had been conducted. He loved it, Martha said, looking at her hands. That was the worst of it. He wasn't doing it for money or for power, not primarily. He loved the work the way a scholar loves a problem. He genuinely believes that what they were doing was the most important scientific project in human history. He thinks he's a visionary. He's a murderer, Amy had said. Yes, Martha agreed. That too. John, in a low voice, I want to be clear about something. We are not going down there to confront Voss alone. We are going down to confirm his presence, and then I am going above ground and I am getting Briggs and at least 2 other officers and... Amy, already descending, yes. John, following, you agree. Amy, I agree that is the sensible and appropriate course of action. John, after a pause, why do I believe approximately 40% of that statement? Amy, from below, because you're an experienced detective with good instincts. The passage was as they had left it. The symbols on the walls, the branching tunnels, Amy moving through them with an assurance that still unnerved John, not consulting the navigational marks, but simply knowing, as though the tunnels existed in her body as well as in the stone. At a junction 300 yards in, she stopped. She raised one hand. John stopped too. John, barely a breath, someone's in the chapel. Amy, equally quiet, yes. They move, slowly, the lamplight minimal, both lanterns reduced to the smallest possible flame, the voice ahead growing incrementally louder. John, mouthing, not making sound, Voss. Amy nods. She takes a step forward, and then another. And then she is in the doorway of the chapel, and John has his hand on the revolver, and the old man at the altar has not yet turned. And then he stops speaking. And he turns. And he smiles. VOSS, quietly with the absolute composure of a man who has never, in 67 years, permitted himself to be visibly afraid. Well, he stands slowly with the care of an old man's bones. I wondered if this day would come. I am almost, he pauses, considering, relieved. He looks at Amy with an expression John cannot categorize, not guilt, not fear, but something that has traces of both and is ultimately neither. Something more like professional respect, filtered through something vast and dark. You look exactly as you did. That is remarkable in its way, a success I never properly documented. Amy, stepping fully into the chapel, you don't seem surprised. VOSS, I'm not. He looks past her to John, taking note of the revolver. Inspector John. Yes, I know who you are. I've known about your investigation for, some weeks now. My sources in the police are somewhat diminished since the recordings were made, but not entirely absent. John, leveling the revolver, Sir Edmund Voss, I'm placing you under arrest for. VOSS, not moving, yes, for murder, for multiple murders, for crimes against various other categories of persons. He waves one hand not dismissively but thoughtfully as though acknowledging items on a list. I rather expected the formality. Do proceed. Amy, stepping closer, why? VOSS, turning his full attention back to her, why? Amy, why did you do it? Not the research. I understand the research. I understand the covenant. I understand the science, or whatever you want to call it. She is very close now, close enough that John wants to call her back, but doesn't. Why them, those specific women? Why not yourself, or your colleagues, or someone who consented? A very long pause, the fire in the brazier, the ancient stone. VOSS, quietly I have asked myself that question many times. He looks at Amy with those pale old eyes. The honest answer is that we could not. The procedure was destructive in its early form. The subjects did not survive it. We needed people who were expendable, in the eyes of the world. A pause. I don't offer that as justification. I offer it as explanation. Amy, they weren't expendable. They had names. VOSS, after a pause, yes, they had names. Amy, Harriet Colton, the woman no one knew about, the one in the letter. Something crosses Voss's face, brief, sharp, quickly controlled. VOSS, how do you know about? Amy, because I remember everything. She reaches into her coat and removes the letter from the abandoned apartment, preserved, careful, 10 years old. She was the one you didn't intend. She found something out, and she was dealt with privately, not in the streets, not in the manner that made the newspapers. VOSS, very quietly, she was a colleague's wife. Amy, she was a person. Silence. VOSS, and for the first time something genuine and not carefully managed enters his voice, old and tired and too late. Yes, she was. He looks at Amy for a very long time. What are you going to do? Amy, I have cylinders, 2 and 3, the methodology, the names. She holds his gaze. I have the testimony of Martha Galloway. I have the notes from the underground tunnels. I have the letter about Harriet Colton. I have 10 years of evidence, and I have a detective with a revolver. A pause. What do you think I'm going to do? Sir Edmund Voss was arrested in the underground chapel on the night of December the 14th, 1898. He was brought above ground through the Galston Street's entrance, where Constable Briggs and 2 colleagues were waiting. John had, it transpired, telegraphed Briggs from a nearby post office before descending, with instructions to meet him at the Galston Street's entrance at a specified time. The revolver had been a precaution, not a plan. Amy had known this. She had said 40%. Church was arrested the following morning. He offered no resistance and provided, over the subsequent weeks, a comprehensive and extraordinarily detailed account of the Covenant's activities, its membership, its methods, its sources of funding and protection. He did this, he said, not out of remorse, but out of an academic's instinct for documentation. He wanted the record to be complete. Of the 14 names on Cylinder 2, 6 were already dead. 3 were in poor health and would not survive to trial. The remaining 5 were arrested, tried, and convicted on charges ranging from conspiracy to commit murder to the improper disposal of human remains. The Victorian justice system doing its best with crimes that did not fit neatly into any pre-existing legal category. It was not a satisfying reckoning. It was the kind that history usually provides, incomplete, delayed, partial, conducted in the face of those who would have preferred the matter remain buried. But it was something. 3 weeks after Voss's arrest, Amy Marsh left Arthur John House on Commercial Road. She told him she was going on the morning she went, which gave him approximately 30 seconds to register that she was serious before she was at the door. John, where? Amy, I don't entirely know. She is wearing her dark coat. Her tin box is in her pocket. He had given it to her after Nunhead, and she had kept it close ever since. I have time, more of it than I expected. I intend to use it. John, you intend to use it? Amy, there are others, other subjects of the Covenant, some of whom may not know what was done to them, some of whom may be confused, frightened. She pauses. I found my way through it. I think I might be able to help others do the same. John, after a moment, that's a rather large undertaking for one person. Amy, very slightly, and for perhaps the first time in John memory, something that might be a smile. I have time. John sets down his coffee. He looks at her, this extraordinary young woman with her ancient eyes and her tin box of buttons and colored glass and feathers, and he does something he has not done in approximately 15 years. He hugs her. Briefly, awkwardly, with the uncertain physical language of a man for whom physical affection has fallen well out of practice. John, gruffly, releasing her right, well, he clears his throat. Telegraph if you need anything, or if you find any more impossible things that need investigating. Amy, at the door I'll likely be several years. John, I know. She opens the door. The streets beyond, fog, gas lamps, the sounds of the East End morning. Amy, without turning back, you should empty that file cabinet, Arthur. John, very quietly, yes, I know. She walks out. The door closes. John stands in his hallway for a moment, then goes back to his study, sits down in his armchair, and looks at the file cabinet in the corner. The one he has not opened in 10 years, the one containing everything he collected on the case that wouldn't leave him alone. He looks at it for a long time. Then he opens it. Arthur John retired properly in 1901. He left London for the coast, somewhere in Sussex, on the chalk cliffs above the Channel. He walked every morning. He ate breakfast looking at the sea. He never entirely stopped looking at the maps. John V.O. Amy Marsh died on October the 22nd, 1888, at the age of 12, in a fire on Dorset Streets, Whitechapel. This is recorded in the municipal register and is, to the best of the knowledge of those who maintain that register, a fact. Amy Marsh returned to Whitechapel on November the 3rd, 1898, aged approximately 22 in years and something else entirely in a deeper sense, and proceeded to unravel the greatest unsolved crime of the Victorian era through a combination of a memory that forgot nothing and a patience that had no visible bottom. Whether she was a ghost, no, she was verifiably physically present. She drank tea. She left impressions in chairs. She ate half a buttered scone on November the 7th and remarked that currants were underrated. Whether she was entirely human. This is a more complicated question, and I leave it to philosophers and physicians more qualified than I to resolve. What I can say with certainty is that she was brave, not in the fashionable sense, not carelessly or dramatically, brave in the older sense, the sense that implies continuing to walk toward something that frightened you because walking toward it was the only alternative to letting it win. I hope she is well. I suspect she is remarkable. I suspect she always was. Epilogue, the fog remains. Whitechapel, not 1898 later, much later. The gas lamps long since electric, the cobblestones in some places paved over in others, new buildings, new people, the same fog. The covenant of persistent lives was never publicly disclosed. The trials of its surviving members were conducted quietly, their crimes described in terms that avoided the specific nature of the research, partly out of genuine legal difficulty in categorizing the offenses, partly out of the Victorian establishment's bottomless capacity for preferring not to examine itself too closely. The Ripper murders remained officially unsolved. The files stayed sealed. The questions stayed open. Whitechapel continued. She was seen in Paris in 1903, in Vienna in 1907, in New York in 1912, 3 days after the Titanic sank, where she was observed in the offices of a private investigation firm that dealt in cases with no conventional explanations. She was seen in London again in 1923, in Whitechapel, on the streets that had been Dorset Streets and had been renamed. A woman who looked exactly as she had looked in 1898, 22, pale, dark-eyed, impossibly unchanged. She stopped in front of a building that had replaced the one where her family had lived and worked. She stood there for a moment. She reached into her pocket and took out a tin box, small, rusted at the seams. She opened it and looked at the contents. Then she closed it and put it away. She walked on. London's fog does not forget. It watched the night Jack the Ripper last walked these streets. It watched the night Amy Marsh came back. It is watching still. The Whitechapel murders of 1888 remain officially unsolved. 14 names were found on a wax cylinder recovered from beneath a deconsecrated chapel in Spitalfields in 1899. The Metropolitan Police sealed the contents under the Official Secrets Act. The file has never been officially reopened. Amy Marsh was declared dead on October 22, 1888. Her death has never been officially corrected. She remembered everything. That was the only superpower she needed, that. And the patience of someone who knows that time is the one thing she has plenty of. Arthur John, Private Journal, December 1898.